Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'd like to talk about a very important concept in photography. A concept that you need to really understand well before you can shoot manual on your camera. Of course, for every camera there's the auto setting. You can use full auto and you can use shutter priority or aperture priority. But if you really want to shoot manual, there's a very important thing you need to understand, and this is commonly called the exposure triangle. What is the exposure triangle? The exposure triangle is basically three sets of settings that helps control the exposure of your image, basically saying how bright or how dark your image is going to be. And there are three concepts that make up the exposure triangle, and this is the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. The shutter speed is basically how fast or how slow your shutter opens and closes. The opening of the shutter, what does it do? It exposes the sensor of your camera to light. Shutter speed is measured in fraction of a second. On your camera, you are going to what you will be seeing is 1/100, 1/120, 1/160, 1/180, 1/1000. What this essentially means is 1/100th of a second. That is, when you divide 1 second into 100, it will take your shutter that amount of time, that fraction of a second, for it to open and close. And in this period of time, this short period of time, what it does is to expose your sensor to light. So the longer the time, the more exposure the sensor of your camera is, the more brighter your image tends to be. Let's take for example 1/150 is slower compared to 1/200. 1/150 exposes your sensor to light compared to 1/200, meaning your picture is going to be brighter at 1/150 compared to 1/200. Apart from the brightness of your image, another thing that shutter speed does for you is to freeze image. It freezes motion. So meaning the faster your camera freezes motion, the less motion blur you are going to see in your image. For example, you are taking a picture of somebody running. The faster your shutter speed, the more you're able to capture the motion. For example, a football game, if you are shooting a football game at 1/100, then most likely you are going to get motion blur. When you decide to shoot at, let's say, 1/2000, 1/3000, then your camera is going to freeze the motion. Two things shutter speed does for you: one, it determines the amount of time it takes for your sensor to be exposed to light. The other thing it does for you is to freeze motion. The second thing now is the aperture. Your aperture is determined by your lens. So usually when you remove your lens from your camera and you put on your camera, you definitely see that the apertures on your camera is 0, 0, meaning there is no lens on your camera. But when you put your lens back onto your camera, then on the aperture setting you are going to see some numbers. Aperture is measured in f-stop, usually f1.2, f2.8, f4, f5.6. What this aperture means is that it means how open or how narrow the hole in your lens is going to be. The smaller number on your aperture indicates a wider opening on your lens, while the bigger number indicates a narrow opening on your lens. Take for example, you are shooting at f1.2. It means your lens is really wide open, while shooting at f22 or let's say f10, your the opening in your lens is relatively narrow. Just like shutter speed, your aperture also affects the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor. This is because when your lens is wide open, let's say at f1.2, the amount of light that gets into your sensor, it's pretty much, and compared to the amount of light that is going to get into your sensor when you are shooting at f10 when your lens is narrow. Ultimately, at lower f number, which gives you a wider opening, your picture tends to be brighter, all things being equal, while as larger f number, which gives you a narrow opening in your lens, your picture tends to be darker, because the amount of light getting into your sensor is affected by the opening on your lens. Another major thing that your f-stop does for you is it affects your depth of field. Now, what does your depth of field mean? Your depth of field is basically how in focus your objects are. A shallow depth of field means just a small area in your image is in focus, while the foreground or the background of your image is out of focus. That is, it is blur. Take for example, with a shallow depth of field, this mic is going to be sharp, while I will be blur, or my background will be blur. With f5.6 to, let's say, f22 or f10, you get a wider depth of field, meaning you get a lot of things in focus. So let's take for example, usually in portrait images, whereby you see the individual is sharp whereas the background is blur. In most cases, they make use of a lower f stop. Two things your aperture does for you: it also controls the amount of light that gets into your lens due to the opening in the lens, and it also controls the depth of field, that is, how in focus or out of focus a particular portion of your image is going to be. The last but not the least is the ISO. Shutter speed and the aperture seems to be things that are mechanically controlled. Your ISO is more or less the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. It's basically how your camera puts in effort by itself to brighten your images, and the lower ISO means less sensitivity, while higher ISO means more sensitivity. With the lower ISO, your camera contributes little or nothing to the brightness of the image, while at high ISO, your camera contributes a lot to brighten the image. With lower ISO, your camera does not have grain in the image, and this grain is referred to as noise. So once you are bumping up your ISO, as the camera is putting in effort to compensate for light, it tends to bring in more noise into your image. That's why when you zoom your image to some extent, you tend to see some dot greenish like dot in your images. These three things work hand in hand together depending on what you are trying to achieve. Let's take for instance, you are trying to shoot a landscape photography, meaning with landscape you need the whole of your image to be in focus. At that point, you won't need to use a low f-stop. Rather, you need to bump up your f-stop to, let's say, 11, 16, and so on to get wider depth of field. With that, there's a possibility that your image is going to become darker. What do? You use your speed to compensate for your aperture. Since your picture has gotten darker, you can reduce your shutter speed. This is why it's called exposure triangle, because all the three things work together in order to properly expose your image, and depending on what you want to achieve will determine which of the settings you will adjust. And whenever you adjust one settings, you are most likely going to adjust the other in order to properly expose your image. Truth is, there's no right or wrong in photography. All you need to do is to understand each of these things and know why you are changing each settings. If you find this video helpful, kindly leave a like, comment and subscribe. If you have any question, don't forget to leave it in the comment section. I will definitely reach out and make another video to answer your question. Thank you.